Africa continued. The IQ of Africans bears on three further arguments against hereditarianism. The last of these is somewhat technical, and I would bypass it but for the currency it has gained. The first, by choosing a heritability of 0.5 for intelligence, Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza, 1970, calculate that for genetic factors to explain the present 1 standard deviation race gap in the United States, the blacks above the 85th percentile in intelligence in each generation since the start of slavery would have had to fail to reproduce. They rightly doubt so high a level of selection against IQ. What Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza must assume, however, is, quote, that there was no initial difference in IQ between Africans and Caucasians, and that the divergence of black Americans from Africans started from slavery about 200 years ago, end quote. This conflicts with the low IQ of present-day Africans. If the first slaves were as intelligent as whites, so too was the African stock from which they came. Assuming a mean African IQ of 100 at the start of the slave trade, the present African mean of 73 requires more intense selection against IQ in Africa than Bodmer and Cavalli-Sforza find plausible for the United States. Not only does their assumption and objection collapse, this assumption is not needed for the IQ difference in the United States to be genetic. The simplest hereditarian position is that the European-African difference already existed when slavery began. Duh! Holy. These objections to hereditarianism are just like nonsense. It's unbelievable. Second, Cavalli-Sforza, Manossi, and Piazza, 1994, argue that the typical black and white share 99.84% of their genes. How then can whites and blacks differ with respect to genetic intelligence when their genetic separation is so small? I never thought of that. You're so right. How could they can't possibly be genetically less intelligent because we share so many genes. I'm so stupid. What was I thinking? Mentioning similar findings, Tooby and Cosmides, 1990, dismiss all, quote, folk beliefs and ethnic group differences. If you think different ethnic groups have different capabilities, it's just a folk belief. It's just an old wives' tale, okay? You're out of touch with modern science, man. You're the idiot, okay? Racism is for stupid people. It's only for hillbillies, rednecks, country bumpkins. I have already addressed this question in a general way. 0.0016 is small in absolute terms, but even different species are surprisingly similar by this standard. Humans and chimpanzees share 98.4% of their genes, for instance, because most human and chimp genes go to building hearts, lungs, and other shared gross structures. Fine differentiation, such as that between the coordination of a championship golfer and a duffer, someone who's bad at golf, is the work of a minute portion of the genome. There is no a priori reason that a 0.16 difference in genes could not manage the nuance needed to differentiate 70 IQ from 100 IQ human brains. More important, as an empirical matter, one cannot assume, as Cavalli-Sforza, Manossi, and Piazzi implicitly do, that genetic effects are linear, that the black-white gene overlap is 1,000 times the chimp-human overlap does not make blacks 1,000 times more like whites than chimpanzees are like humans. The human-gorilla difference, at 2.5%, is twice the human-chimp difference, but chimps are not midway between gorillas and humans in phenotypic intelligence. It's really sad that arguments like these even have to be demolished. I can't believe people are even making them in the first place. The performance of other minorities. The claim that racism harms black mental development rests on two premises: that subtle forms of racism are omnipresent, penetrating even intervention and transracial adoption, and that racism of this sort retards intelligence. Environmentalists have generally assumed the second without argument, but the superior performance of minority groups that have been less advantaged socially than blacks suggests that it is untrue. Jensen summarizes the case of American Indians. Quote, on a composite of 12 socioeconomic status and other environmental indices, the American Indian population ranks about as far below black standards as blacks rank below those of whites. Within each ethnic group, these indices are correlated with IQ and scholastic achievement, but it turns out that Native Americans score higher than blacks on tests of intelligence and scholastic achievement from the 1st to the 12th grade. On a nonverbal reasoning test given in the 1st grade, before schooling could have had much impact, Native American children exceeded the mean score of blacks by the equivalent of 14 IQ points. Thus, the IQ difference between Indians and blacks turns out opposite to what one would predict from the theory that ethnic group differences in IQ merely reflect socioeconomic status differences. Do I need to read that again? Jensen notes a similar finding about Mexican Americans. As is well known, Asians and Jews in all cultures have succeeded in the face of sometimes murderous hostility. Jews in medieval Europe were legally confined to ghettos and forbidden to engage in certain trades. Were they victims of segregation, or were they self-segregating? It's kind of a chicken and egg situation. If they didn't want to be segregated, maybe they shouldn't be so different. Pogroms occurred regularly in Tsarist Russia. For no reason whatsoever, remember. They just get hated for no reason. And the Nazis tried to exterminate Jews. Yet, Jews dominate the list of Nobel laureates in science and field medalists in mathematics, are overrepresented by a factor of 10 in American college teaching, medicine, and law, and make up 25% of the former Soviet Academy of Science. There are a lot of ways to explain that other than intelligence. Not that they aren't intelligent. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. The Nobel Prize was awarded to Albert Einstein. The moron, plagiarist, scumbag, but it was not awarded to Nikola Tesla, who basically invented modern society. And also the Nobel Peace Prize went to Barack Obama, Barack Drone Bomber. So winning a Nobel Prize, it's not really the flex that you think it is. If someone told me that they won a Nobel Prize, I would not be remotely impressed until I found out what it was that they won the prize for. It's not automatically prestigious, is what I'm trying to say. And 25% of the former Soviet Academy of Science, well, they were about 85% of the Soviet government that took over Tsarist Russia and formed the Gulag, which killed 60 million people approximately, depending who you ask. So, yeah, of course they're going to be overrepresented. Anyway, Jews have formed resurgent, prosperous communities in Poland and Germany. Before 1930, Jews were a marginal presence in my own field, philosophy. Yet by the mid-1990s, the majority of the most influential academic philosophers were Jewish. Fisher et al., 1996, make much of, and considerably distort, the fact that some Jewish immigrants to the United States were once thought dull. However, any period of supposed Jewish dullness was quite short, and in every society in which they have participated, Jews have eventually been recognized and disliked for their exceptional talent. No. You're not disliked for being talented. If that were true, why wouldn't we dislike all talented people? You think it might be something else? Lack of self-awareness, clearly, is one of the issues. This book is written by a Jewish guy, by the way. He sounds just like a rabbi. Oh, everyone hates us because we gave them morality and they want to be immoral, and we're just the most moral people in the world, and they hate us because we show them what it looks like to be moral, and it makes them feel inferior. Oh, they hate us because we're so skilled and talented. Oh, no, we like skilled and talented people. We don't like people who think that they're chosen to rule the world. We don't like people who worship a God that mass murders babies. Moving on. Just to pick up where we left off, Jews have eventually been recognized and disliked for their exceptional talent. Blacks have not made the transition to brightness in the American context despite great efforts to help them do so, and have never been thought of as elite in any mixed-race culture. Many environmentalists appeal to culture to annul intergroup comparisons, explaining Jewish achievement in law and intellectual pursuits as a residue of Talmudic scholarship, and Asian academic success similarly, in terms of academic values in Asian families. Yet such explanations sidestep the basic question, namely, why Jews developed a tradition of complex legal reasoning in the first place, and why Asians value academic success. To say oppression selected for high Jewish intelligence treats group intelligence as a biological adaptation. Such question begging is endemic to the cultural explanation of group variation. They do not tell us what we really want to know, namely why different groups have developed the different cultures they have. Bolder environmentalists deploy neutralizing by clear statement, a rhetorical device of presenting an objection to one's position with no attempt to meet it, suggesting that there is a reply too obvious to mention. Thus, Hacker's apostrophe to a black, quote, "You find yourself continually subjected to comparisons with other minorities. Most stinging of all are contrasts with recent immigrants. You hear people just off the boat, or nowadays a plane, extolled for building businesses and becoming productive citizens, which is another way of asking why you haven't matched their achievements, considering how long your people have been here. Moreover, immigrants are praised for being willing to start at the bottom. The fact that so many of them manage to find jobs is taken as evidence that the economy still has ample opportunity for employment. You want to reply that you are not an immigrant, but as much a citizen as any white person born here. Perhaps you can't match the mathematical skills of a teenager from Korea, but then neither can most white kids at suburban high schools. You feel much like a child being chided because she has not done as well as a precocious sister. However, you are an adult and do not find scolding helpful or welcome." End quote. Here, Hacker drops the subject. Yet, while scolding may not be appropriate, the question he seeks to deflect is, if blacks are as innately able and diligent as Asians, why are they less successful? Hacker is pleased to note Asian mathematical superiority to whites as well as blacks, but not that the Asian-black gap is much larger. But the jibe has a point only because mathematical ability is important. That granted, the failure of blacks to match Asians in mathematics suggests an important race difference. Calling the question unwelcome does not answer it. When preparing this chapter, I came across a paper by John Ogbu, purporting to explain in environmental terms why other minorities outperform blacks. This paper was so flimsy that I ignored it, fearing that criticizing it would weaken my own case. Yet I have since encountered several respectful references to it, by, for example, Fisher et al. 1996 and Neisser et al. Also 1996. So some discussion of it is necessary. Ogbu, 1987, claims that because blacks, unlike other immigrant groups, were brought to the United States forcibly, they have no incentive to adopt such American values as hard work and school. Blacks distrust the majority culture and see, quote, cultural differences as markers of identity instead of barriers to be overcome, end quote. The most obvious flaw in this theory is that, while slaves were, quote, an involuntary minority, end quote, American blacks have been free to emigrate for 5 generations. During the last century and earlier parts of this one, the Back to Africa movement urged by both white nativists and black nationalists had few takers. I wonder why. Judging by their behavior, contemporary American blacks are where they are voluntarily. Judging by their behavior, contemporary American blacks are where they are voluntarily. Moreover, like many environmentalist hypotheses, Ogbu's suggests no mechanism by which involuntary minorityhood reduces IQ, nor does Ogbu present any evidence linking an ability to return to the homeland to academic failure and poor test performance. Most important, the involuntary minority hypothesis requires blacks on their own to do as well as American whites, and they do not. As we have seen, American blacks outperform African blacks on standardized intelligence tests, and, with the exception of South Africa, until recently run by whites, majority black countries are the poorest and most crime-ridden in the world. Environmentalists who credit race differences to culture must give a non-circular account of why black and white cultures differ. Hereditarians are equally obliged to give a non-circular account of genetic race differences. Speculation has long focused on the different pressures exerted by the African and Eurasian climates. Survival in the colder climates of Europe and Northern Asia requires technologies unnecessary in Africa. Clothing has to be fabricated, fires sustained, food hunted and stored. These constraints favored the ability to plan, in turn entailing ingenuity and low time preferences. Planning is less adaptive in warmer climates where food is easier to get and spoils when stored. Hunting also selects more strongly for cooperativeness and reciprocity than does individual gathering and harvesting. Rushton, 1988, conjecturally organizes this differentiation around two reproductive strategies. Reproductive rate, or R, strategists, such as fish, produce numerous offspring, few of whom survive. Across species, the R strategy associates with lower intelligence, greater investment in reproduction than in postnatal care, short gestation periods, an accelerated life history, opportunistic feeding, little inter-individual cooperation, lax social structure, and boom or bust population cycles. Carrying capacity, or K, strategists, typically large mammals, produce a few offspring in widely spaced litters and care for them long after birth. The K strategy associates with higher intelligence, regular feeding habits, pair bonding, cooperation, complex social structure, and longevity. Rushton argues that the greater adaptiveness of the R strategy in Africa made Negroids more R, which would explain the lower mean black levels of intelligence, self-restraint, and social organization, as evidenced by failure to form stable political units beyond the tribe, or, in the United States, the gang, and a stronger black reproductive drive as measured by illegitimacy, age of menstruation, age of first intercourse, age of first pregnancy, frequency of intercourse, and marital instability. An intriguing phenomenon resistant to environmental explanation emphasized by Rushton is the race difference in litter size. There are 4 pairs of dizygotic twins per 1,000 births for Mongoloids, 8 per 1,000 for Caucasoids, and 16 per 1,000 for Negroids. Black infant mortality remains twice that of whites even when social factors are controlled for. An accelerated life cycle is suggested by the greater maturity of black babies when gestation period is controlled for, their greater developmental precocity, and the constancy of the race difference in life expectancy during the 20th century. One need not accept the R versus K strategy analysis to expect evolution to diverge in environments as dissimilar as Africa and Eurasia. Knowing only that blacks, whites, and Asians differ genetically, conversely, one would expect that they had developed in different environments. The two inferences support each other. End of chapter. Footnotes. Just got a few here. Number 1, if from the moment of conception each child's nature helps to determine his nurture, and each child's nurture helps to determine his nature, it is not meaningful to calculate what proportion of a child's aggressive behavior is due to his genes or his environment. Actually, it is meaningful. This footnote is from the beginning of the chapter where he was saying that some people caution so emphatically that all phenotypes are the joint product of genes and environment as to imply the two are inseparable. Well, just because things can be genetic and environmental, that doesn't mean that it's irrelevant how much of it is genetic and how much of it is environmental. Because if the genetic aspect only allows for a certain range of phenotypes, then no amount of intervention is going to bring one population to the same level as another population, no matter how much opportunity you give them. So you can't keep blaming the lack of achievement on the environment. Oppression, racism, lack of opportunity, blah, blah, blah. So it does matter what proportion of a child's aggressive behavior is due to his genes or environment, actually. Footnote number 35. While the mean IQ of Asians exceeds that of whites, the Asian variance may be smaller. It's kind of like man versus woman IQ. The bell curve. I don't know if you're familiar with the distribution, but there's more male retards and more male geniuses, and a smaller curve in the middle, whereas women have few retards, few geniuses, a big bulge in the middle. So the average is the same, but the distribution is different. So there's more male geniuses, which explains a lot. Explains the patriarchy. In the same way, there's more white geniuses. Even if the average IQ of Asians is higher, that doesn't mean that they have more geniuses, necessarily. While the mean IQ of Asians exceeds that of whites, the Asian variance may be smaller, leading Block, 1993, to suggest that there may be fewer Asian geniuses of the sort responsible for scientific breakthroughs. That would explain it. Footnote 51. To anticipate the topic of Chapter 8, there is no obvious injustice in more money being spent on white children than blacks, so long as the money is spent by whites, because whites are wealthier than blacks. The 12.8% of Connecticut's population that is black does not pay 12.8% of the taxes supporting its schools. I'm sure it's quite a bit less. The fact that anything like the same money is spent on black as white children should be described as white generosity. I agree. And lastly, footnote 52, in reference to when he was saying that Jews became very prominent in philosophy, he writes, after 30 years of affirmative action, blacks constitute about 1% of the profession, the philosophy profession, mostly pursuing marginal topics related to race. All right. See you in Chapter 5. Determinism, Reductionism, Reification, Racism.